I was working at a planetarium in Munich when an American woman in her mid-20s asked me if the moon was just the back of the Sunday. I stared at her for a solid 5 seconds trying to figure out if she was joking. She was not. She said, "Think about it. You never see them at the same time." I told her you absolutely can see the moon and sun at the same time during the day. She said, "That's the moon's reflection." I asked her reflection in what? She said, "The sky." I didn't even know where to start. I explained that the moon is a separate celestial body orbiting Earth. She said, "But they're the same size in the sky." I told her that's because of their relative distances, not because they're the same object. She squinted at me and said, "You're part of big astronomy, aren't you? You guys always have an answer for everything." She left to tell her boyfriend that I was trying to indoctrinate her. My cousin is a marine biologist in Australia, and she was giving a talk at a school when an American exchange student raised his hand and asked if fish get thirsty. She said no, fish absorb water through osmosis. He said, "But what if they're in the ocean and want fresh water?" She explained that saltwater fish are adapted to their environment. He said, "So they never drink?" She said they process water differently than land animals. He said, "That's sad. Someone should invent fish water bottles." The entire class laughed. He got defensive and said, "I'm serious. We put water in aquariums, so obviously fish need to drink." My cousin tried one more time to explain, but he cut her off and said, "I think fish are just really good at hiding when they drink." He would not let it go. For the rest of the semester, he brought it up constantly. I was at a natural history museum in London, standing near the dinosaur exhibit, when an American family walked up. The dad looked at the T-Rex skeleton and said, "How did they get all the bones if dinosaurs are extinct?" His wife said, "They must have found them." He said, "But who killed it?" She said, "Nobody. It died naturally." He said, "Then how is it a full skeleton? Wild animals would have eaten it." His teenage son said, "Dad, fossils." The dad said, "Fossils are rocks." "These are bones," the son said. "Fossils are mineralized bones," the dad said. "So they're fake." The son gave up. The dad turned to me and asked if the museum made replicas because the real skeletons were too valuable. I told him many museums display real fossils. He said, "That seems dangerous. What if someone steals a dinosaur?" I told him they're very heavy. He said, "Still, I wouldn't risk it." He walked away, shaking his head like the museum was being irresponsible. My friend is a botanist in Costa Rica, and she had an American tourist on an eco tour who insisted that plants weren't alive. The woman said, "They don't move or think, so they're basically decorations." My friend explained that plants are absolutely alive. They grow, reproduce, and respond to stimuli. The woman said, "Responding isn't the same as being alive." My friend asked what her definition of alive was. The woman said, "Having feelings." My friend said, "So bacteria aren't alive?" The woman said, "Correct." My friend said, "That's not how biology works." The woman said, "I think scientists make things too complicated. Alive should mean it has a brain." My friend said, "What about jellyfish?" "They don't have brains," the woman said. "Then they're not alive either." My friend told her she fundamentally misunderstood life itself. The woman said, "Agree to disagree." She left the tour early because she said it was boring learning about decorations. I was on a flight to Tokyo sitting next to an American man who asked me if we were going to fly over the edge of the Earth. I laughed. He didn't. He said, "I'm serious. How does the pilot know where the edge is?" I asked if he thought the Earth was flat. He said, "I'm not saying it is, I'm just asking questions." I told him the Earth is round and there is no edge. He said, "That's what they teach, but have you personally verified it?" I said, "I've flown around the world multiple times." He said, "You flew in a circle. That doesn't prove it's a sphere." I gave up and put my headphones on. An hour later, he tapped my shoulder and said, "If we're flying to Japan and Japan is on the other side, Why don't we fall off when we get there? I pretended to be asleep for the rest of the flight. I worked at a science museum in Amsterdam, and an American dad brought his kids to the physics section. There was an exhibit about gravity. He read the sign and then loudly announced, "This is a theory, not a fact." His kids said, "But things fall down." He said, "Right. But nobody knows why." I couldn't help myself. I walked over and said, "We do know why. Gravity is the attraction between masses." He said, "That's just a theory." I explained that in science, theory means a well-supported explanation, not a guess. He said, "So you're telling me gravity is real?" I said, "Yes. Extremely real." He said, "Then why do balloons float?" I said, "Because helium is lighter than air." He said, "But gravity should pull them down." I said, "It does, but buoyancy counteracts it." He said, "That's two different forces. One of them has to be wrong." I walked away. I heard him tell his kids not to trust everything museums say. I was volunteering at a wildlife rehabilitation centre in South Africa when an American woman asked if we could teach the lions to be vegetarian. I asked her why. She said, "So they stop killing other animals. It's cruel." I explained that lions are obligate carnivores and biologically require meat. She said, "But humans can be vegetarian." I said, "Humans are omnivores. Lions are not." She said, "Have you tried?" I said, "Tried what?" She said, "Giving them vegetables." I told her yes. Lions in captivity are studied extensively, and they cannot survive without meat. She said, "That's just because they're addicted to it. If you slowly reduce their meat intake, they'd adjust." I told her that's not how biology works. She said, "I think you're not trying hard enough because it's easier to keep feeding them meat." She asked to speak to the head veterinarian. He told her the exact same thing. She left a donation with a note saying it should be used for plant-based lion food research. My brother is a geologist, and he was at a conference in Las Vegas when an American guy at the hotel bar started talking to him. My brother mentioned he studies rocks. The guy said, "What's there to study? They're just rocks." My brother explained geological processes, mineral composition, tectonic activity. The guy said, "But they're not alive. How is that science?" My brother said, "Chemistry and physics are sciences too." The guy said, "Yeah, but those matter." "Rocks just sit there," my brother said. "Rocks tell us about Earth's history." The guy said, "The Earth is like 6,000 years old. How much history can there be?" My brother asked if he was religious. The guy said, "What does that have to do with rocks?" My brother said, "Radiometric dating shows rocks that are billions of years old." The guy said, "Those tests are rigged." My brother asked who would rig them and why. The guy said, "Scientists, so they can keep getting funding." My brother finished his drink and left. I was working at an aquarium in Vancouver when an American family stopped at the octopus tank. The mum read the information card and said, "It says octopuses have 3 hearts. That's impossible." I walked over and said, "It's true. 2 pump blood to the gills and 1 to the rest of the body." She said, "Nothing has 3 hearts." I said, "Octopuses do." She said, "How do they all beat at the same time?" I said, "They're coordinated by the nervous system." She said, "That sounds made up." Her husband said, "Honey, it's on the sign." They wouldn't lie. She said, "They're trying to make octopuses sound more interesting than they are." I offered to show her scientific papers. She said, "I don't need papers. I need common sense. 3 hearts is excessive." She walked away. I heard her tell her kids that aquariums exaggerate facts for attention. My friend teaches chemistry at a high school in Berlin, and she had an American exchange student who refused to accept that water is H2O. The student said, "Water is just water." My friend said, "Water is made of hydrogen and oxygen atoms." The student said, "No, it's a liquid." My friend said, "Yes, a liquid made of molecules." The student said, "I drink water every day. If it had hydrogen in it, I'd be drinking the stuff from the Hindenburg." My friend explained that hydrogen bonded with oxygen is completely different from hydrogen gas. The student said, "That doesn't make sense. Hydrogen is hydrogen." My friend drew molecular diagrams. The student said, "This is why American education is better. We don't overcomplicate things." My friend said, "This is basic chemistry." The student said, "In America, water is water and we don't worry about what's in it." She failed chemistry. She blamed the German education system. I was at a volcano observatory in Hawaii and an American tourist asked me why we don't just put out the lava. I said, "Put it out how?" He said, "With water, like a fire." I explained that lava is molten rock at over 2000 degrees and water would just evaporate. He said, "What if you used a lot of water?" I said, "You'd need an impossible amount and it still wouldn't work." He said, "What about foam, like firefighter foam?" I said, "Foam is for chemical fires, not molten rock." He said, "Someone should invent lava foam." I told him the volcano is a natural process and not something we should try to stop. He said, "That's a lazy attitude. In America, we solve problems." I said, "This isn't a problem, it's geology." He said, "It's a problem if it destroys property." I said, "Don't build on an active volcano." He said, "That's limiting freedom." I had to walk away before I said something unprofessional. I worked at a space center in Florida, and an American woman asked me if astronauts have ever visited the Sunday. I said no, the sun is far too hot. She said, "What if they go at night?" I thought she was joking. She was not. I explained that the sun doesn't turn off at night. She said, "But it's dark at night." I said, "Because Earth rotates away from the sun, not because the sun stops existing." She said, "So the sun is always on?" I said yes. She said, "That seems wasteful." I didn't know how to respond. She said, "Someone should invent a solar panel that covers the whole sun so we can use all that energy." I told her the sun is 93 million miles away and 1,000,000 times larger than Earth. She said, "Okay, so it would be a big project, but think of the energy savings." I told her to enjoy the rest of the space center. She said, "I still think the night thing could work if they planned it right." I was giving a tour of a chocolate factory in Switzerland when an American teenager asked if chocolate comes from brown cows. I said no, chocolate comes from cacao beans. He said, "But it's brown." I said, "So is dirt. That doesn't mean cows make it." He said, "Then why is chocolate milk from brown cows?" I said, "Chocolate milk is regular milk with chocolate added." He looked stunned. He said, "So brown cows are fake?" I said, "Brown cows exist, they just don't produce chocolate milk." He said, "Then what's the point of them?" I said, "They're still cows, they produce regular milk." He said, "That's false advertising." I asked what was false about it. He said, "They're brown, they should make chocolate milk." His friends were laughing at him. He got defensive and said, "I'm not the only one who thought this. Everyone thinks this." Nobody backed him up. He spent the rest of the tour sulking. My sister is a meteorologist in Norway, and she was doing a TV segment about the Northern Lights. After the broadcast, an American viewer emailed the station asking if the lights were dangerous to look at. My sister replied that they're perfectly safe. The viewer wrote back saying, "But they're in the sky. Isn't that where radiation is?" My sister explained that the northern lights are caused by solar particles interacting with Earth's atmosphere. The viewer said, "Solar means Sunday, sun causes cancer. Therefore northern lights cause cancer." My sister tried to explain the difference between UV radiation and auroras. The viewer said, "I'm just being cautious. You should warn people." My sister said there's nothing to warn about. The viewer accused her of downplaying health risks for tourism money. The emails continued for 3 weeks. My sister eventually stopped responding. I was working at a zoo in San Diego when an American couple asked me why the penguins weren't flying. I said, "Penguins can't fly." The woman said, "All birds fly." I said, "Penguins are flightless birds." The man said. Then they're not birds. I said, they are birds. They just evolved to swim instead of fly. The woman said, that's backwards evolution. I said, evolution doesn't have a direction. The man said, flying is better than swimming, so they should have evolved to fly better, not worse. I explained that penguins are perfectly adapted to their environment. The woman said, their environment is wrong then. I asked what she meant. She said, if they lived somewhere that required flying, they'd still have wings that work. I said, they do have wings. They use them to swim, the man said. That's a design flaw. I gave up. They stood at the penguin exhibit for 20 more minutes, trying to convince a penguin to fly. My friend is an engineer in Germany, and he was showing an American client around a factory. They walked past a machine, and the client said, why is this in Celsius? My friend said, because we're in Germany. The client said, can you change it to Fahrenheit? My friend said, the entire system runs on Celsius. The client said, that's inefficient. Fahrenheit is more precise. My friend said, Celsius is used globally in science and engineering. The client said, that doesn't make it better. My friend pulled up a conversion chart. The client said, see, you need a chart. That proves Fahrenheit is simpler. My friend said, you only need a chart if you don't know Celsius. The client said, nobody knows Celsius. My friend said, billions of people know Celsius. The client said, I meant nobody important. My friend ended the tour early. The client complained to his company that the factory was unprofessional for using metric. I was at a science fair in Tokyo, and an American kid presenting a project insisted that microwaves cook food from the inside out. The judge said, that's not correct. The kid said, yes it is. That's why the inside is hot. The judge explained that microwaves heat water molecules throughout the food, but heat transfer still works from outside in. The kid said, my mum told me they cook inside out. The judge said, your mum is mistaken. The kid got upset and said, are you calling my mum a liar? The judge said, I'm correcting a misconception. The kid said, this is cultural bias. Maybe Japanese microwaves work different than American ones. The judge said, physics is universal. The kid said, that's just your opinion. He did not win the science fair. He told everyone the judges were unfair because he was American. I worked at a hospital in Sweden, and an American man came in with a minor cut. The doctor cleaned it and said he didn't need stitches. The man said, don't I need antibiotics? The doctor said, not for this. The man said, in America, they always give antibiotics. The doctor explained that overusing antibiotics creates resistant bacteria. The man said, that sounds like socialist medicine. You're rationing healthcare, the doctor said. I'm practicing evidence-based medicine. The man said, I want antibiotics anyway. The doctor refused. The man said, what if I get infected? The doctor said, keep it clean. You'll be fine. The man left angry. He went to 3 more doctors trying to get antibiotics. They all said no. He flew home and told people that Sweden has a healthcare crisis because doctors refuse to prescribe medication. I was working at a tech museum in Seoul when an American woman asked me if phones cause earthquakes. I said no. She said, but there are more earthquakes now than before. I said, we're just better at detecting them. She said, or there are more because everyone has phones. I explained that seismic activity is caused by tectonic plates. She said, but phones have vibrations. I said, not strong enough to affect tectonic plates. She said, what if everyone's phones vibrated at the same time? I said, it still wouldn't matter. She said, you don't know that. I said, yes I do. The science is clear. She said, science changes all the time. I said, not about this. She left unconvinced. I saw her later telling her family that scientists refuse to study the phone earthquake connection because phone companies pay them off.